The day I signed the divorce papers, my husband smiled. Not the warm smile he used to wear at charity galas or company parties. This one was colder, sharper, victorious. We were sitting in a high-rise law office in downtown Chicago, 29 floors above the gray winter streets. The room smelled like leather chairs and expensive cologne. Victor Langston looked completely relaxed as he adjusted the cuff of his suit. His lawyer slid the final page across the table. "Mrs. Langston, if you'll sign here." My hand didn't shake. I had rehearsed this moment for years. 8 years, to be exact. I signed my name. Lisa Harper. Not Lisa Langston anymore. The pen clicked softly when I set it down. For a brief second, the room was silent. Victor leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, like a man finishing a long and exhausting task. "Well," he said calmly, "that's finally over." His lawyer gathered the papers with professional efficiency. The divorce of Victor Langston, one of Chicago's most influential construction executives, had just been finalized. Victor stood up and buttoned his jacket. Then he looked at me with the same expression a CEO might give an employee being escorted out of the building. "By the way," he said casually, "there's something you should know." I tilted my head slightly. "What is it?" He smiled again. "All joint accounts were frozen this morning." The words landed softly. Too softly for what they meant. My face didn't move. Victor continued speaking like he was discussing the weather. "Your credit cards are canceled. The house security code has been changed. You'll need to collect your personal belongings tomorrow between 9 and 11. His lawyer didn't react. Clearly, this had been planned. I folded my hands on the table. "And where?" I asked quietly. "Do you expect me to go?" Victor shrugged. "That's not really my concern anymore, Lisa." For 14 years, I had been his wife. For 14 years, I had attended his corporate dinners, smiled beside him in photographs, hosted charity events, and played the perfect supportive partner. Now he was dismissing me like an expired contract. "You always said you wanted independence," he continued. "Now you have it." Outside the window, snow drifted slowly across the skyline. Chicago looked beautiful from this height. Cold. Indifferent. Victor glanced at his watch. "I have a meeting in 40 minutes, he said. "So, if there's nothing else." "There isn't," I replied. For a brief second, he studied my face. He expected tears. Or anger. Maybe even begging. Instead, I simply stood and picked at my coat. His expression flickered with faint confusion. "You're taking this surprisingly well," he said. I met his eyes calmly. "You wanted the divorce." "That's not what I meant." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Let me give you some advice, Lisa. Life is expensive in this city. Without access to those accounts," he paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "You might want to move somewhere cheaper." I almost smiled. Almost. Instead, I nodded politely. "Thank you for the suggestion." We walked toward the elevator together. Victor seemed lighter now, like a man who had finally removed a weight from his shoulders. When the elevator doors opened, he turned to me one last time. "You'll figure something out," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. The doors closed. I watched his reflection disappear in the mirrored walls as the elevator descended. 29 floors. 28. 27. The moment the lobby doors opened, my phone buzzed in my purse. A notification from my bank. Account access restricted. Another message followed. Credit card terminated. Victor Langston had just done exactly what he always planned. He believed that without his money, without his house, without his name, I was nothing. Completely powerless. Completely alone. I stepped outside into the freezing Chicago air and pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders. Cars rushed past. People hurried down the sidewalks, unaware that my entire life had just been erased. For a few seconds, I simply stood there. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out another phone. A small black phone Victor had never seen. I turned it on. One unread message appeared instantly. "Megan, is it done?" I looked up at the gray Chicago skyline. Victor thought today was the day he destroyed me. But in reality, today was the day everything finally started. I typed 2 words and pressed send. It's time. People often assume revenge begins with anger. For me, it began with silence. 8 years earlier, I had been standing in the kitchen of our house in Lincoln Park when Victor said something that changed everything. He didn't realize it at the time. To him, it was just another careless sentence. "You wouldn't survive a month without me," he said while scrolling through his phone. I remember the exact moment. Morning sunlight was coming through the tall windows. I was pouring coffee into his favorite mug, the one from a construction conference in Dubai. He didn't even look at me when he said it. Not cruelly, just confidently, like it was an obvious fact. At that time, I was exactly what everyone believed I was. A stay-at-home wife. Victor's supportive partner. The woman who organized charity dinners and remembered birthdays for his business partners. I had once worked in marketing before we married, but Victor insisted it made more sense for me to focus on the home. And slowly, over the years, I became invisible in his world. At first, the invisibility hurt. Later, I realized it was the greatest advantage I could ever have. Because when people stop noticing you, they stop watching. That morning in the kitchen, after Victor left for work, I sat at the table with my laptop open for nearly an hour. Not crying, not angry, just thinking. If Victor ever decided to leave me, what would happen? The answer was obvious. I would lose everything. The house wasn't in my name. Most accounts were controlled through his company. His lawyers were aggressive. And Victor hated losing. If a divorce ever happened, he wouldn't just walk away. He would make sure I had nothing. That realization didn't terrify me. It clarified things. So that afternoon, I opened my laptop again. And I started learning. Finance. Accounting. Corporate structures. Risk analysis. At first it was simple online courses. Free ones. Victor never noticed because I always did them late at night after he fell asleep. Within a year, I understood balance sheets better than most of the junior analysts in his company. Within 3 years, I could read financial statements like roadmaps. But learning was only the first step. Preparation required something else. Patience. Victor earned millions through his construction empire. Large commercial projects across Chicago and the Midwest. Small numbers inside those finances disappeared easily. A few dollars saved from grocery budgets. Small freelance consulting jobs I did quietly online. Tiny investment accounts opened under my maiden name. Nothing dramatic. Nothing risky. Just small streams of money slowly forming a reservoir. Over 8 years, those small streams grew. Not into millions, but enough. Enough for independence. Enough for freedom. But money wasn't the only preparation. I also watched Victor carefully. His habits. His business partners. The way he handled negotiations. Victor believed power meant control. He liked dominating conversations. Pressuring people. Making them feel dependent on him. It worked in business. It worked in marriage too. But that personality had weaknesses. Victor underestimated anyone he believed weaker than himself. Especially me, the harmless wife. The woman who hosted dinner parties and smiled politely. I encouraged that illusion. I never argued about finances. I never asked questions about his company. I never challenged his decisions. The less threatening I appeared, the more confident he became. And confidence creates carelessness. By year 5, I knew something important. Victor was planning the divorce long before he filed it. Men like Victor rarely act suddenly. They prepare. Quietly. I began noticing subtle changes. Lawyers visiting more often. Certain financial accounts restructuring. Properties shifting ownership between corporate entities. Most wives would panic. I didn't. Because by that time, I was already ready. When Victor finally asked for the divorce 6 months ago, he looked almost relieved. Like he expected drama. Tears. Begging. Instead, I said something very simple. If that's what you want. The shock on his face lasted only a second. But I noticed it. From that moment on, Victor believed he had complete control over how this would end. He believed I was too passive. Too dependent. Too naive. And today, sitting in that Chicago law office while he froze my accounts and threw me out of our home. He was absolutely certain of one thing, that I had never prepared for this moment. As I walked down the icy street after the divorce, my second phone vibrated again. Another message from Megan. Do you need a place tonight? I looked up at the tall glass towers surrounding me. Victor thought I had just lost everything. In reality, I had just been set free. I typed my reply.
No.
Then I added one more line. Everything is exactly where it needs to be. 3 days after the divorce, I moved into a place Victor would never imagine me living. The building stood between a pawn shop and a liquor store on the west side of Chicago. The hallway smelled faintly of cigarettes and old carpet cleaner. The landlord didn't ask many questions. He just looked at my suitcase and the envelope of cash I placed on the counter. 1 room, he said. That's all I need, I replied. The room itself was barely larger than Victor's walk-in closet. A narrow bed, a metal desk, a small window that overlooked an alley filled with overflowing trash bins. Perfect, because appearances matter. And right now, my appearance needed to tell a very specific story. A divorced woman with nowhere else to go. The first thing I did after unpacking was turn on my old laptop. Then I began doing something very deliberate. I started leaving a trail. Public job applications. Low-paying assistant positions. Receptionist roles. Administrative work. Nothing impressive. Nothing connected to finance or strategy. Just the kind of desperate job search someone might make after losing everything. I even visited a few offices in person. One of them was a small insurance agency downtown. The receptionist looked at my resume with mild confusion. You were married to Victor Langston? She asked. I gave a small, embarrassed smile. Yes. And now you're applying for an entry-level position? Life changes, I said quietly. She nodded with sympathy. Exactly the reaction I wanted. By the end of the week, the story had already started spreading through the quiet networks of Chicago's business community. Victor Langston's ex-wife was struggling, living somewhere cheap, looking for basic work, trying to rebuild. I knew it was spreading because Megan told me. We spoke late that evening using the second phone. Word is everywhere already, she said. People think he completely wiped you out. I sat on the narrow bed, looking around the tiny room. That's good. You're sure you wanted to look this bad? It needs to. Silence lingered on the line for a moment. Victor believes you're finished, Megan said. That's the goal. The more confident Victor became, the less careful he would be. And confidence was already working in my favor. 2 days later, I saw proof. I was sitting in a small cafe near downtown when Victor walked in with 2 executives from his company. He didn't notice me immediately. I had chosen a corner table near the window. Simple clothes. No makeup. Just another woman drinking cheap coffee. Victor was laughing about something when his eyes suddenly moved across the room. And then he froze. For a brief moment, something flashed across his face.
Surprise.
Maybe even curiosity. He walked over. Well, he said slowly. I didn't expect to see you here. I looked up from my cup. Hello, Victor. He glanced around the cafe. This is quite a downgrade from the places you used to like. I'm adjusting. One of his colleagues shifted uncomfortably behind him. Victor leaned slightly closer. Found a job yet? Still looking. He studied me carefully, trying to read something in my expression. But all he saw was calm resignation. Finally, he nodded once. Well, good luck. Then he turned and walked back to his table. I watched him through the reflection in the window. He was smiling again. The smile of a man completely certain of his victory. Later that evening, my phone buzzed again. A message from Megan. He told someone at the office today that you're harmless. I leaned back against the thin pillow on the bed. Harmless. The word made me smile slightly. Because Victor Langston believed something very important. He believed that a woman living in a cheap room with canceled credit cards could not possibly threaten him. He believed I was weak, defeated, broken. But illusions can be powerful tools. And the illusion of defeat is often the most dangerous one of all. I placed the phone on the nightstand and turned off the light. Tomorrow was the day everything truly began. Because tomorrow, I was going to start dismantling Victor Langston's empire. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The small room was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic moving through the city. For a moment I lay still, staring at the cracked ceiling above the bed. 8 years of preparation had led to this point. Now, the real work would begin. I sat up, reached for the black phone on the nightstand, and dialed a number that only 3 people in the world knew existed. Megan answered on the second ring. "You're up early," she said. "So are you." "I barely slept," she admitted. "If we're really doing this, everything changes after today." I looked toward the small window where pale morning light was beginning to appear. "Yes," I said quietly. "It does." Megan had been my closest friend since college. Unlike most people in Victor's social circle, she had built her career independently. Corporate law. Precise. Careful. Exactly the kind of mind I needed involved in what came next. "Are you sure he suspects nothing?" she asked. "He saw me in a cafe yesterday," I said. "He thinks I'm looking for entry-level jobs." Megan laughed softly. That must have made his week. "That's the idea." Silence settled between us for a moment. Then she asked the question that mattered most. "So, are we activating it?" For years, the plan had only existed as documents, encrypted files, and quiet conversations. A contingency. A strategy one hoped I would never actually need. But Victor had made his decision when he froze my accounts and threw me out of the house. Now, the contingency became reality. "Yes," I said. "We activated today." Megan exhaled slowly. "All right," she said. "Then we call it by its proper name. Operation Stormfall." The name had started as a joke years earlier during one of our late-night strategy discussions. But over time it became something much more structured. The plan itself wasn't illegal. It wasn't sabotage. It was something far more dangerous to a man like Victor. Exposure. Victor's construction empire relied heavily on confidence. Investors trusted his leadership. Suppliers trusted his payment schedules. Banks trusted his expansion plans. If that confidence weakened, even slightly, everything could start shifting. And over the years, I had quietly collected information. Contracts. Financial patterns. Supplier relationships. Nothing stolen. Nothing illegal. Just observations. The kind of information someone could gather simply by paying attention during 14 years of marriage. "Phase 1 begins today," Megan said. I stood and walked to the small desk in the room. My laptop was already open. Several encrypted folders appeared on the screen. Inside them were documents I had spent years organizing. "Start with the supply chain," I said. "Already working on it," Megan replied. "One of the steel providers has concerns about delayed payments on a previous project."
Good.
Doubt spreads quickly in business, especially when money is involved. "What about the investor meeting next week?" she asked. "I've prepared something for that too." Victor believed his company was expanding smoothly. But in reality, several of his projects were balanced on fragile financial timelines. Small disruptions could force uncomfortable questions. Questions lead to audits. Audits lead to scrutiny. And scrutiny is something Victor Langston had never handled well. "Once this starts," Megan said carefully, "there's no stopping it." "I know." His company could unravel. "That's not my responsibility." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Megan said something quietly. "You know, he still believes you're powerless." I looked around the small room again. The peeling paint. The narrow bed. The cheap desk. "Yes," I said. "That illusion is very important. Because if Victor ever suspected the truth, he would fight. Aggressively. But right now, he believed I was struggling to survive. And men like Victor rarely look for threats from people they consider defeated." "First contact is scheduled for noon," Megan said. "With who?" "A financial consultant who works with one of Victor's lenders."
Perfect.
Not an accusation. Not a warning. Just a conversation. Sometimes a single quiet conversation is enough to plant a seed of doubt. And doubt spreads quickly in the financial world. Before ending the call, Megan asked one final question. "Lisa, after everything he did, is this revenge?" I thought about that carefully. Then I shook my head, even though she couldn't see it.
No.
What is it then? I closed the laptop slowly. It's accountability. Victor Langston believed he had removed me from the board. But what he didn't realize was that I had been studying the entire game for 8 years. And today, I finally made my first move. The first crack appeared 3 days later. Not in public. Not in the news. Just a quiet phone call inside Victor Langston's office. I wasn't there, of course. But Megan heard about it within an hour. She called me while I was walking through a small grocery store near my rented room. Something just happened, she said. I paused beside a shelf of canned soup. Tell me. One of Victor's steel suppliers delayed a shipment this morning. I placed a can in my basket slowly. Delayed? Officially? Administrative review. That was perfect. Construction projects run on tight schedules. A delay of even 2 or 3 days can cause serious financial pressure. What was Victor's reaction? I asked. Apparently, he wasn't worried. I smiled faintly. Of course he wasn't. 1 delay is an inconvenience. 2 delays become a pattern. 3 delays become a problem. But right now, Victor believed everything was under control. That afternoon, I sat at the small desk in my room with my laptop open. Several financial reports were displayed on the screen. Victor's company, Langston Development Group, was larger than most people realized. Commercial buildings, residential towers, infrastructure contracts. But the expansion over the last 5 years had created something dangerous.
Debt.
Not reckless debt, but aggressive debt. The kind that only works as long as projects continue moving smoothly. Interrupt the momentum, and things start shifting quickly. At exactly 3:15 p.m., Megan called again. You're not going to believe this. What happened? The Westbrook Investment Group just postponed their funding meeting. I leaned back in my chair. Westbrook Capital was supposed to inject nearly $30 million into Victor's newest project. Why? I asked. Apparently, someone raised concerns about cash flow projections. Of course they did. Because sometimes all it takes is a quiet conversation between financial professionals to trigger caution. No accusations. Just questions. Questions are powerful. By the next morning, the second crack appeared. Another supplier delayed a shipment. This time concrete materials. Victor's project managers began making calls. Emails started moving through the company. Most employees still believed these were simple logistical issues. But Victor was beginning to notice something unusual. The delays weren't random. They were clustered around 2 specific developments his company was currently building. Both of those projects depended on tight financing schedules. Both of those projects were also heavily leveraged. Megan called me again that afternoon. He had an emergency meeting this morning. With who? His finance department. And Victor thinks the delays are coincidence. That didn't surprise me. Confidence blinds people, especially powerful men who are used to winning. But even Victor couldn't ignore what happened next. Late that evening, Westbrook Capital officially withdrew from the investment deal. $30 million.
Gone.
Not canceled permanently, just postponed, until they completed additional financial reviews. Which meant Victor suddenly needed to cover a massive short-term funding gap. I sat quietly in my small room as Megan finished explaining. Investors are starting to ask questions, she said. And Victor? He's angry. Anger was predictable. Victor handled pressure by pushing harder, threatening, demanding, trying to force the world back into order. But financial systems don't respond well to anger.
They respond to risk.
And risk was beginning to appear around Langston Development Group. 2 days later, the first rumors started circulating in Chicago's construction circles. Nothing dramatic, just whispers. Something about delayed financing, possible liquidity pressure. Most people ignored it. But rumors move quickly when money is involved. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Megan. Victor just told someone the company is fine. I read the message twice. Then I replied. Of course he did. Because Victor Langston still believed something very important. He believed these problems were temporary. Coincidences. Minor disruptions. He had no idea that the ground beneath his empire had already begun shifting. And the most dangerous part for him was that this was only the beginning. 5 days after the first supplier delay, Victor finally realized something was wrong. Not publicly, not dramatically, but internally, inside his company. Megan called me just after sunset. He canceled 2 meetings today, she said. That's unusual for him. Very. Victor Langston built his reputation on control. He rarely postponed anything, but pressure was building. Suppliers hesitating. Investors asking questions. Cash flow tightening. Still, he believed it was temporary. What Victor didn't know was that another process had already started moving quietly in the background. One that had nothing to do with investors or construction delays. It started the next morning. I took a train downtown and walked into a quiet federal office building near the Chicago River. The building looked intentionally unimpressive. Gray walls. Minimal signage. The kind of place people passed every day without thinking about what happened inside. I checked in at the front desk. "I have an appointment," I said calmly. The receptionist looked at her computer. "Name? Lisa Harper." She typed something, then nodded. "4th floor. Room 417. The elevator ride felt longer than it actually was. When the doors opened, a man was already waiting near the end of the hallway. Mid-30s. Dark suit. Professional posture. He extended his hand. "Mrs. Harper?" "Yes." "Daniel Brooks. A federal financial investigator." We stepped into a small conference room. No windows. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a folder already waiting on the surface. Daniel didn't waste time. "You mentioned in your message that you had documentation regarding Langston Development Group." "Yes." He opened the folder. Inside were printed copies of several financial summaries I had prepared. Not stolen files. Not hacked records. Just something simpler. Patterns. Transactions that didn't quite align with public reporting. Loans structured through complicated shell arrangements. Short-term debt moved between projects in ways that increased risk exposure. None of it was proof of a crime, but it was enough to justify a closer look. Daniel studied the pages carefully. "You were married to Victor Langston for 14 years, he said. "That's correct. And you're providing this information voluntarily." "Yes." He looked up at me. "Why now?" I didn't hesitate. "Because these patterns have been growing more aggressive over the past few years." "That's a financial risk concern," he said carefully. "Not necessarily a legal violation." "I understand." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "So, you're asking us to investigate your ex-husband's company." "I'm asking you to review the financial structures." That was the key difference. I wasn't accusing Victor of anything. I was simply pointing out that something might deserve attention. Daniel closed the folder slowly. "Most people in your situation would want revenge." I met his eyes calmly. "This isn't revenge." "Then what is it?" "Accountability." For a moment he studied my face carefully, trying to decide whether I was emotional, bitter, manipulative. But I had practiced this composure for years. Finally, he nodded once. "If these structures raise regulatory concerns," he said, "we'll look into them. That's all I'm asking." He stood and walked me to the hallway. Before I left, he said something quietly. "You should know something, Mrs. Harper." "What is it?" "If an investigation begins, it will be confidential at first." "That makes sense." "But eventually," he added, "things tend to become public." I gave a small nod. "I understand." Outside, the Chicago wind felt colder than usual. I walked slowly along the river, watching the reflections of the city lights in the water. Victor believed his problems were coming from the market, from investors, from nervous suppliers. He had no idea another layer had just been added beneath the surface, one far more dangerous than delayed shipments. Because financial investigations don't move quickly. They move quietly,
Carefully.
patiently, just like I had for the past 8 years.
And now?
The storm surrounding Victor Langston was beginning to grow. The first time Victor called me after the divorce, I didn't answer. My phone vibrated on the small metal desk while I was reviewing financial notes on my laptop. His name appeared on the screen. Victor Langston. For a moment, I simply watched it ring. Then it stopped. A minute later, it started again. This time I answered. Hello. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, like he wasn't expecting me to actually pick up. Lisa. His voice sounded different. Tighter. Controlled. Yes. I need to ask you something. I leaned back in the chair, letting the phone rest lightly against my ear. What is it? You've been talking to people. Not a question. A statement. I allowed a small pause. I talk to people every day. Don't play games with me, he said sharply. There it was. The first crack in Victor Langston's confidence. What exactly are you accusing me of? I asked calmly. Another silence. Then he said something that confirmed everything. Investors are suddenly nervous. Suppliers are hesitating. People are asking strange questions about our financing. Our financing? Interesting. And you think that has something to do with me? You've always been smarter than you let people believe, he said. That was almost a compliment. Almost. I'm living in a rented room and applying for receptionist jobs, I replied. How exactly would I be influencing your investors? Victor didn't answer immediately, because he didn't have proof. Only suspicion. I'm warning you, Lisa, he said finally. If you're interfering with my business. With what resources? I interrupted gently. That stopped him again. Victor had personally frozen every account connected to me, canceled every card, locked me out of the house. In his mind, he had removed every possible tool I could use, which made his suspicion feel irrational even to himself. You always had a talent for manipulation, he muttered. I almost laughed. Instead, I kept my voice neutral. You divorced me, Victor. You removed me from your life completely. That doesn't mean you get to sabotage my company. I leaned forward slightly. Then maybe your company has problems that have nothing to do with me. The silence on the line lasted longer this time. Victor finally exhaled. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. Less aggressive. More calculating. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot with the divorce. There it was. The pivot. Men like Victor rarely apologize. But they negotiate. What are you suggesting? I asked. I could release some funds to you. I waited. Call it a settlement adjustment. Interesting. How generous. I'm serious, Lisa. How much? Another pause. 500,000. I let the number sit in the air for a moment. To Victor, it probably sounded extremely generous. But what he was really offering was silence. Insurance. If you're worried about your business, I said slowly, maybe you should focus on fixing whatever's wrong inside it. Don't pretend you're innocent. I'm not pretending anything. His patience was starting to break again. Listen carefully, he said, his voice dropping lower. If I find out you're behind any of this, you'll what? The question hung between us. Victor didn't answer, because, for the first time in his life, he didn't know what move to make. Finally, he said something much quieter. This isn't over. No, I agreed calmly. It isn't. He hung up. I placed the phone back on the desk and sat there for a moment. Outside, evening traffic moved slowly through the city streets. A few minutes later, my other phone buzzed. A message from Megan. Victor had another emergency meeting today. I typed back. He called me. Her response came instantly. Already. I smiled slightly. Victor Langston was beginning to panic. And panic makes powerful men dangerous. But it also makes them careless. And the more careless Victor became, the faster everything around him would start to fall apart. 2 weeks after Victor's first phone call, the investigation quietly began. Not publicly, not loudly, just small, careful steps. The kind most people never notice. But Victor did. Because by that point, problems inside Langston Development Group were multiplying faster than his executives could contain them. Another supplier suspended deliveries. 2 banks requested updated financial disclosures. And one of Victor's largest lenders scheduled what they called a routine compliance review. There is nothing routine about those words. Megan called me late that evening. He's losing control, she said. How bad? Worse than he's telling people. I sat at the small desk in my rented room while rain tapped against the window. Explain. She lowered her voice slightly. One of his internal accountants contacted outside counsel. That caught my attention.
Why?
Because they're starting to notice inconsistencies. I leaned forward. What kind of inconsistencies? Debt transfers between projects that don't match reported numbers. Temporary loans moving through smaller subsidiaries. Short-term liabilities being hidden inside development partnerships. None of it sounded dramatic on the surface. But in finance, patterns matter. And Victor had been moving money aggressively for years. Not necessarily illegally, but dangerously. Projects funded by debt. Debt supported by future projections. Projections depending on constant growth. As long as everything expanded, the system held together. But once investors hesitated, once suppliers delayed, once lenders began asking questions, the structure became unstable. What about the investigator? Megan asked quietly. Daniel? Yes. I checked the message I had received earlier that afternoon. He contacted me today. And he wants additional documentation. There was silence on the line. Lisa, that means they're taking this seriously. Yes. Daniel hadn't accused Victor of anything.
Not yet.
But the financial patterns I showed him had raised enough concern to justify a deeper look, which meant auditors were now quietly reviewing transactions connected to Langston Development Group. And auditors noticed things. 3 days later, Victor called again. This time his voice sounded different. Not just tense. Frustrated. What did you do? He demanded the moment I answered. Hello to you too. Don't play games, Lisa. I stayed calm. What's happening, Victor? You know exactly what's happening. Actually, I don't. He exhaled sharply. Federal regulators contacted my accounting department. I didn't respond immediately. They're asking questions about internal financing structures, he continued. How strange. Stop pretending. His voice echoed slightly through the phone. I could picture him standing in his office, pacing across the polished floor. Did you contact them? He demanded. That sounds like a serious accusation. Did you, or didn't you? I let a quiet pause fill the space between us. Then I said something simple. If your company's finances are clean, you have nothing to worry about. Victor went silent. For a long moment, I heard nothing but his breathing. Finally, he spoke again. You think you're clever.
No.
You think this investigation will hurt me. I think investigations reveal things. His tone hardened. You're playing with something you don't understand. That was almost funny. Because for 8 years, understanding Victor's financial world had been my entire focus. I hope your accountants cooperate fully, I said calmly.
He didn't respond.
Then the line went dead. I set the phone down and stared at the screen for a moment. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the city. A few minutes later, Megan texted me. More investors are asking questions. Then another message appeared. Victor's legal team is preparing for potential audits. I read the messages slowly. Victor Langston had spent years building his empire, tower by tower, project by project. But empires built on confidence collapse the moment confidence disappears. And now, the people who once trusted Victor were starting to look closer, much closer. Soon they would begin seeing things he never expected anyone to notice.
Secrets. Hidden debts.
Risky financial structures. And once those secrets came to light, even Victor Langston wouldn't be able to stop what came next. The collapse didn't happen all at once. Empires rarely fall in a single moment. They crack. They shift. And then suddenly, everyone notices the damage. The first public sign appeared on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in a quiet cafe near the train station, reading financial news on my laptop, when Megan's name flashed on my phone. I answered immediately. It's happening, she said. Her voice carried the kind of tension that only comes when a situation has crossed a point of no return. What happened? I asked. The audit. I closed my laptop slowly. What about it? It's no longer confidential. For 3 weeks the investigation had stayed quiet. Auditors reviewing documents. Financial regulators requesting reports. But something had changed. Victor's lenders demanded a full external review this morning, Megan continued. And they leaked it. that was enough. In the world of finance, once an audit becomes public knowledge, confidence evaporates almost instantly. What's the market reaction? I asked. Bad. How bad? 3 investors already pulled out of upcoming projects. I leaned back in my chair, watching pedestrians move past the cafe window. And Victor? He's in damage control mode. Of course he was. Victor's entire career had been built on projecting confidence. But the problem with confidence is that once doubt appears, it spreads faster than truth. Within 48 hours, the story reached industry news. Nothing dramatic at first. Just a headline in a Chicago financial publication. Langston Development under regulatory review. But that was enough. Banks began tightening credit lines. Contractors started demanding upfront payments. 2 development partners paused ongoing negotiations. Victor's empire wasn't collapsing yet, but the pressure was building everywhere. Then came the hearings. They weren't criminal trials.
Not yet.
Just formal financial reviews. Victor had to appear in person with his legal team to answer questions from regulators and lenders. Megan attended one of those meetings. She called me immediately afterward. You should have seen his face. What happened? They presented the transaction reports. The same patterns Daniel had been investigating. Complex debt transfers. Short-term loans moved between shell subsidiaries. Risk exposure hidden across multiple projects. Again, none of it was automatically illegal, but it was reckless. And reckless behavior terrifies investors. What did Victor say? I asked. He tried to explain it as strategic financial management. I almost smiled. Victor had always been good at sounding confident. But confidence doesn't work well under scrutiny. Then someone asked a question, Megan continued. What kind of question? Where the information originally came from. I felt my heartbeat slow slightly. And Victor realized the room had apparently gone quiet, because suddenly Victor Langston understood something. These financial patterns weren't public knowledge. Very few people had access to them. And only one person had spent 14 years close enough to notice everything.
Me.
What did he do? I asked. He looked around the room like he was trying to find you. That image stayed with me. Victor sitting at a long conference table, surrounded by lawyers and auditors. Finally understanding the truth. That everything unfolding around him hadn't been coincidence. It had been preparation. After the meeting, Megan said quietly, he told his lawyer something. What? He said, she planned this. I looked out the cafe window again. Chicago's skyline rose in the distance, calm and indifferent. Victor Langston had once believed I couldn't survive without him, that freezing my accounts and throwing me out would leave me helpless. But now his investors were leaving. His lenders were nervous. And his company's reputation was unraveling in front of him. Megan's voice softened slightly. Lisa, he finally knows. Yes, I said quietly. And for the first time since the divorce, Victor Langston was no longer certain he was the most powerful person in the room. Victor called me one last time. It happened a week after the hearings. By then, the situation around Langston Development Group had become impossible to hide. Several projects were officially suspended. 2 banks had frozen additional credit lines, and the investigation into the company's financial practices was expanding. Chicago's business news talked about it every day. The headlines weren't dramatic, just careful, measured. But the meaning was clear. Victor's empire was collapsing. I was sitting in the same small rented room when the phone rang. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something told me this call mattered. So I answered. Hello. Victor didn't speak immediately. When he finally did, his voice sounded nothing like the confident man who had thrown me out of our house. You planned this. It wasn't anger. It was realization. I stayed quiet. For 8 years, he continued slowly. You were preparing. You're giving me too much credit.
No, he said.
I'm finally giving you the right amount. I looked around the room. The cheap desk. The narrow bed. The cracked paint on the wall. This place had served its purpose. Why? Victor asked. The question surprised me.
Not how. Not when. Why?
You froze my accounts. I said calmly. You threw me out with nothing. That's not why. He was right. That wasn't the real reason. So I told him the truth. Do you remember something you once said to me? Silence. You told me I wouldn't survive a month without you. Another long pause. You built your entire life believing that, I continued. That people around you were dependent, replaceable. Victor didn't interrupt. But I spent 8 years proving something different. What? He asked quietly. That I didn't need your permission to exist. The line stayed silent for several seconds. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a strange mixture of anger and reluctant respect. You destroyed my company. No, I replied softly. You did that yourself. I meant it. Victor's empire hadn't fallen because of sabotage. It had fallen because it was fragile. Too much debt. Too much risk. Too much confidence in a system that depended on constant growth. All I had done was remove the illusion of stability. You could have taken the settlement, he said. I didn't want your money. What did you want? Freedom. Victor exhaled slowly. I underestimated you. Yes, I said. You did. Another silence followed. Then he said something I didn't expect. What will you do now? I glanced at the laptop sitting on the desk. Earlier that morning I had received an official offer. A consulting firm specializing in financial risk analysis had asked me to join their team. Apparently, someone had been impressed by the documentation I prepared during the investigation. I'm starting a new job next week, I said. Victor sounded genuinely surprised. Doing what? Risk analysis. For the first time during the entire conversation, I almost heard him laugh. That makes sense. Yes. Because after everything I had learned over the past 8 years, understanding risk had become second nature. Victor was quiet again. Finally, he said something very simple. I suppose this is goodbye. Yes. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. For the first time since I had known him, Victor Langston sounded like a man who understood the game was over. Goodbye, Lisa. Goodbye, Victor. The call ended. I set the phone down and walked to the small window. Chicago stretched out beneath a gray winter sky. For 14 years, my life had been built around Victor's world. His company, his power, his rules. Now that world was behind me. A few days later, I left the rented room. Not dramatically, just quietly. A small apartment across the city. A new job. A new routine. Victor Langston's empire continued unraveling for months afterward. Lawsuits. Financial restructuring. Partners walking away. In the end, his company didn't disappear completely. But it was never the same again. And neither was I. People sometimes assume revenge is loud, explosive, emotional. But the truth is much simpler. The most powerful victories happen quietly, without anger, without shouting, just patience. Because in the end, I didn't destroy Victor Langston. He destroyed himself.